Hey everyone, Srini Rao here, founder of NotionEssentials.com, and today I am going to go through part 3 of this video about how to make Notion a regular part of your workflow. So in parts 1 and 2, I talked about how to identify what's important as well as organize it so that it doesn't become overwhelming. But now that you've identified what's important, you've got it organized, then that's where the rubber meets the road, because execution is basically how you bridge the gap between vision and reality, ideas and reality. It's basically the key that basically makes your ideas happen. So let's talk about some principles of execution before we get into the actual tactics inside of Notion. The first thing that is really important to do is to give yourself some sort of timeline for completing a project, because if you don't have a timeline for completing a project, it just kind of ends up extending endlessly. There's no finish line. And part of the reason that having this timeline is important is because psychologically there's something known as the Pareto Principle, where we actually will use the time that has been allotted for a particular task. And so if you give yourself an hour to do something, it will take you an hour. But if you give yourself 20 minutes to do the same task, often you can do the same task that normally would take an hour in 20 minutes. So it's really important to keep these kinds of things in mind when you're actually planning out your projects and executing. Now, in a lot of cases, if you're working on a project yourself, for example, writing a book or doing something that somebody else isn't holding you accountable for, then you have to use self-imposed timelines. And that's where we use things like deadlines, some of which we'll talk about and get to the tactics. The other thing that I recommend is that you limit yourself to no more than 5 projects at a time. One of the curses of being a creative person like myself is that we have tons of ideas, we get really excited, so what ends up happening is that we end up going 1 mile in 1,000 different directions as opposed to 1,000 miles in one. Now, 5 projects is actually a pretty high limit, and if 5 seems overwhelming, I actually recommend that you stick to no more than 1 to 2. And once you get momentum going and progress going on the first or second project, then add other projects. Then finally, the important thing to do is to track your progress. And the reason tracking your progress is so critical is because something that is known as the progress principle, based on the work of a professor at Harvard named Teresa Amabile. And what her research shows is that our biggest source of motivation is visible progress. So when we're making progress with a project and we see that we're making progress, we're going to stay motivated and we're going to be much more likely to stick with working on the project and to keep coming back day after day. And I'll talk to you about how to track your progress here in just a second. And then finally, what you want to do is you want to take any project and you want to break it up into the smallest manageable parts. Now, when I say smallest manageable, I mean make them so small that it's impossible for you to fail. And one good litmus test for that is the level of resistance that you feel. So for example, if you feel like, oh, this is too much today, then that means you've made whatever your daily action is a bit too small. It's what I basically defined as a minimum viable action. So for example, one of the things that I do when I teach people how to develop a daily writing habit is, rather than have them try to hit some sort of word count, what I initially do is say, you know what, just for today, open up a notebook, and if you can write one sentence, great. Even if you can't write a sentence, try to just open up the notebook each day. Because what happens when you take what are known as minimum viable actions is inertia starts to kick in, and eventually you will follow through. One other idea around this comes from James Clear, who's the author of Atomic Habits, and I'll include our interview from The Unmistakable Creative with him below in the description as well. But James Clear has a principle called reduce the scope but stick to the schedule. So what do we mean by that? Well, for example, let's say that you're a writer who writes 1,000 words every day, which is something that I do. There are days when I just don't feel like writing 1,000 words. I rarely miss a day, but the thing is that instead of skipping it altogether, what you can do is you can reduce the scope. So let's say that on those days when I don't want to write 1,000 words, I might write 500 words, or maybe I'll write 100 words. The point is that you basically stay in motion, but you still stick to the schedule of doing this thing that you say you're going to do. And this can actually be really, really powerful. In fact, James tells a story about one of his readers who lost 100 pounds just by following this method, where he would start out by just driving to the gym, and that was all he would allow himself to do. And then eventually he said, okay, now that I've been coming here for a week, I'm going to go in, but I can only spend 5 minutes there. Eventually he figured he might as well stay. And over time, he went from somebody who could never go to the gym to somebody who lost 100 pounds. So that's really the power of breaking things up into the smallest manageable parts. So you're taking any habit and you're breaking it up into really, really small components, and that's essential to moving any project forward. So let me show you two examples of moving projects forward. So for example, let's say that you have a project. You can see here that I copied this from my other Notion workspace, so let's not call it copy. But you have a project which is to write a book. Now, there are two different ways that you could track writing a book. You'll see here that Notion gives you the ability to have a status. Now, one thing that a lot of people do in to-do list apps is they make the progress that they're making disappear. And this actually goes against the progress principle, because then you're not going to actually see the progress that you're making. So let's say that, every day for the next week, let's just look at this last week. Let's assume that I did all of this week. And you'll see here that what ends up happening is you say to yourself, wow, every day I'm actually completing something. So the problem is when you use a filter and make these things disappear from your table, then you don't actually see visible progress. Now, you don't have to use status. The other thing that you can do is what's known as the don't break the chain method. And here you can just use a simple checkbox and say, okay, I did this, I did this, I did this. Again, we can basically go to the date. So this is really the key to managing workflow. So we started out by identifying tasks and projects. We organized them into projects and daily tasks and daily responsibilities. And now what we're talking about is execution. And the key to execution is making basically your tasks so small that it's impossible for you not to follow through. And again, if you feel any resistance to it, then it's too big. So you notice here that when I said write a book, I didn't even do something like write the first chapter, write a first page. I said write the first 3 sentences. That's pretty easy if you're somebody who writes 1,000 words. But if you can't even do that, then write 1 sentence. It doesn't really matter how much you do. It just matters that you take consistent action. That's the key to moving projects forward and executing and basically bridging the gap between ideas and reality. And this is how you use this in your Notion workflow. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And if you're interested in a free custom workspace audit, visit notionessentials.com.